I was asked to share my vocation story as a story of joy. And that's not because I'm any more special than anyone else with their vocation stories sitting in this room, but maybe it's because it illustrates several things that may be helpful to all of us as we discern our vocation or living out our vocation in life. That is, first of all, that God is a God of surprises, and we need to be open to surprises. In my case, it's God is a God of terrible shock. But you'll understand that in a few moments. The other thing is, it illustrates for me a tremendous sense of joy. And for me, it was a joy at homecoming to myself and to God. And certainly a God of second chances. But when I speak about the homecoming, it's because any of you who understands anything about cars may appreciate what I mean when I say I'm a retread. So in other words, I was a sister. When I left school in England, I took the usual route. I felt called to religious life, and I was a Franciscan for 6 years. At the end of 6 years, instead of renewing my temporary vows, I decided, no, this isn't for me. The reason I felt that it wasn't for me is at that time, we were very separated from the world. And very much so, almost as though the secular, that was the rest of you, the secular was somehow not quite as important as the religious, and the religious indeed wasn't quite, woman especially, wasn't quite as important as the priest. I had huge problems with that because for me I'd grown up in a wonderfully joyful parish in Cambridge in England, where our faith was part of our whole life. It was always joyful. It was always about everyday life. And so for me, there was this terrible sort of dissonance between what it was I was trying to live with love, and yet this sense of separation, because for me, somehow my spirituality was a spirituality of God in all things, which Kathy is going to be talking about. And so there were a couple of readings this afternoon that actually struck me around this. The first was where Pope Francis is quoting Pope Benedict, when he said this: being a Christian is not the result of an ethical choice or a lofty idea, but the encounter with an event, a person, which gives life a new horizon and a decisive direction. That happened to me. There was an event in my life that made me begin to think. And so it's an invitation, I think, to all of us to be open to that everyday aspect of God in all things, that God who may call us quite surprisingly. In my case, I had been for many years a nurse and a nurse educator, and I had worked in less economically advantaged countries, and I was on a tour setting up some programs in blindness prevention in Bangladesh. Now, even at this point in time, I'd worked in poorer countries for a long while, either as a volunteer and then permanently for a few years. And I had gone to a small village school to talk with our community eye health specialist teachers about how to identify vitamin A deficiency in children's eyes. There was another significant thing there which I won't mention at this point because of the timing. But when we'd finished our little talk, we had to wait for the bus to go back to the city. And we walked down to a river that was in front of this little two-room school. And we were waiting there, looking at this very murky river, and I heard a rustling to my right. And I turned, and despite the fact that I had worked in poorer countries for many years, I think I saw the greatest icon of human poverty that I'd ever seen. And I use the word icon intentionally because those of you know about iconography, it's a form of art that is meant to not be figurative, but to invite us in. And this suddenly invited me in. It was a very poor woman standing holding a baby at the breast, who presumably was getting no milk because she was so emaciated herself, or very unlikely that it was being nourished well. There was an older woman who looked as though she was starving. There was a toddler with all the signs of chronic malnutrition. Their home was just a piece of plastic over a couple of twigs. And outside, symbolically and realistically, there was a cooking pot with nothing in it. Nothing cooking. And that woman looked me in the eye. And it was a moment when God managed to get into stubborn Mary's heart and connect. When she looked at me, I knew immediately I need to change my life. Not I need to change it because I wasn't doing good before or whatever. I mean, I was working for a pittance in poorer countries. But there was that moment of an intimate look, a gaze as Tired de Chardin would have put it, a gaze in somebody's eye through which God spoke to my heart. The change I knew that I would need would be to move to what we as, well, Jesuits talk about it too, what we do, the more. The more in my life, to search for the more. Now, as I've said, I'd been a religious before, and I didn't immediately think, oh, I'm going to go and be a sister of St. Joseph, by any means. That would have been the last thing in my mind, by which I have to tell you I was getting on in years by then. I also had a wonderful life. I lived in Toronto. I had a beautiful home in the annex in Toronto. I used to give parties. My friends would phone me and say, there was this most gorgeous veranda, and they would say, is the balcony cafe open tonight? And I'd sit and drink my gin and tonics with my friends. I had a wonderful professional life. I taught at the U of T. I was an ethicist at the hospital for sick children. I had friends galore. I was a terrible old globetrotter. I went everywhere. I had a wonderful life. And it was a perfectly good life of love. But this nudging that came out of that woman's eye, and I often say, I suspect that poor woman is dead now, given the floods in Bangladesh and other things besides. But she gave me life, and she gave me God's life that said, Mary, stop and think about the more. And so I kind of, well, you know, like we all do, little call, and I think, oh, well, yeah, I'll deal with it tomorrow. I'll deal with it in a year's time. I'm fine. I'm doing everything fine. I have a great life. I think I'm good, goodish. I was never that good, but goodish, you know. I think I'm goodish, and it'll do. And something kept niggling, and still it didn't sort of surface, which is what I mean about this beautiful idea that we have of God in all things. God can manage to get there if our hearts are open, or if God gives us a bit of a push. Now, in my case, the push came when I was at the hospital for sick children, working as a clinical ethicist. And what happened is there was a big scandal that involved the hospital for sick children. One of our researchers, I won't go into all the details of that again because of time. And it was a situation that caused me, as an ethicist, to have to criticize both the hospital and one of the university departments for their take on ethics. At the same time, my friend and colleague George Webster, who was at the Roman Catholic Hospitals in Toronto, was also having a similar trouble where he had to criticize not the hospital in this case, but some of our hierarchy. All right? And George and I were giving a workshop at the University of Toronto one afternoon, and as we were coming out, he said, so how's it going? And I said, it sucks. And I said, how's it going for you? And he said, likewise, ditto, it sucks. And so he said, why don't we go for a beer? And I can still see, you could smoke outside a pub there, I could still see us sitting outside, and he smoked a pipe, and we had a cold beer together. And in the middle of the conversation, the fact that we had to be critical of the hand that paid us, and how difficult that could be, unless you were willing to lose your job potentially, came up. And George just happened as a throwaway comment to say, it makes you wonder who you are. Now, remember, I'd gotten my first question from this beautiful, sad woman in Bangladesh. Here was the next question, it makes you wonder who you are. Now that went in one ear and out of the other, And I continued to drink my beer and have a great evening with George. A few days, I had started to go for some spiritual direction with a sister of Providence who lived in Toronto at the time. And I was to see her a couple of days later. And I went in to see her, and as I was taking off my jacket, even before I got the posterior in the chair, she said to me, "How's it going at Sick Kids? I've been reading about it in the Globe and Mail." And I said, "Oh, I had a beer with George the other night, and he happened to say, it makes you wonder who you are." And she, quick as a switch, said to me, "Well, Mary, have you ever known who you are most authentically?" That was important, those words. Most authentically, most joyfully, most authentically in relationship to God, yourself, and others. And I sort of was poised in the middle of sitting down, and immediately I knew it was when I had made my religious vows many years before. And she said to me, "Well, it's a difficult question. You can think about it until you come next time to see me." And I said, "No, if I'm looking green, it's because instantaneously I knew the answer of authenticity. I knew the answer to that question." And so she said, "What?" And I said, "It was when I made my religious vows." Now, she was good. She didn't come in straight away and say, "Well, why don't you join us?" She said, "Reflect on it," and then moved on to another topic. And I said, "No way. I am not going back there. My life is perfectly good. It's a good life. It's a fabulous life. My faith is alive. I have a great life. There's no way that I am even ever thinking of going back there." And so I convinced myself that all was well, and I could achieve the more where I was. Then one night I was preparing a lecture for medical students, in fact, at Sick Kids, and I was sitting at my computer, working a bit late at the hospital, preparing PowerPoint, and I was just about to switch off the computer, and this little niggling voice came into my head, "Just check out and see what sisters are in Canada or the States." No way. Anyway, not being able to resist it, I went into internet and I checked it out. And I went through I was about 2 hours looking at these. I went through all of these sisters, and I discovered two groups that had an attraction. One was the Sisters of St. Joseph, the other was the Adrian Dominicans. So therein started, and I thought, no way, switch off, get out of here. Put it aside for a little bit longer, it wouldn't go away. Because I think I'd opened myself to hear the voice of God. And so it wouldn't go away, and it wouldn't go away, and it wouldn't go away. And so I thought, I think I better do something about this. Try and get rid of this niggling feeling. Because after all, I'm leading a good life anyway, aren't I? So I decided to go to see my friend and colleague, who was then Dean of Regis College, Father Ron Mercier. And I went in, and he gave me the three most wonderful questions that I'd like to share with you, because they are the best questions I've ever found for discernment for anyone. I've used them for friends thinking of getting married. I've used them for friends thinking of a new job, for friends who were struggling in their marriage. But the questions Father Ron gave to me were critical. And they were based on the idea that, first of all, God loves us, as we heard this morning, that the initiative is always God's. And that is that God loves each of us as we are. And the second is that that calls us to love. Now I'm going to ask you all a quick question that embarrasses the heck out of a lot of people. What happens when you fall in love? It's not a rhetorical question. Somebody, what happens when you fall in love?
You can lose yourself.
You can lose yourself, that's for sure, yes, yeah.
You focus.
You focus, yeah.
On the other
What
person.
choices do you have if somebody says to you for the first time, I love you. I love you, Matilda. I love you, Marilyn. I love you, Chris. when somebody says that to you for the first time in a friendship or a relationship, I love you, Jim, and you know they mean it, what are your choices?
You can say I love you too, or you can run as fast as you can.
Those are the choices. I love you too, and that entails what?
Loving them.
Yes,
Commitment.
absolutely. Loving back, loving in response. It entails a response in love, and in very practical ways too. Or as Kathy says, you can run like hell in the other direction. I was tempted to run like hell in the other direction. I thought, this is ridiculous at my time of life. There's no way I'm going to do it. But Father Ron slowed me down, because the 3 questions he asked me were, if it is the case that we are loved totally and we're called to love, then that is the fundamental human vocation. To be loved, to receive love, that is, and to give love in return. And then he said, whatever you are discerning, whether it's a new job, whether it's a religious vocation, whether it's getting married, whether it's whatever you're discerning, he said, ask yourself, what would it, the thing you're discerning, need to look like in order for you to best be loved and to best love? Now, he didn't say other forms of life aren't loving. I could love in all sorts of forms of life. The question is, how can I most authentically best be loved and loved? And then he says, look at what you're discerning and ask yourself, what would it need to look like? Now, in my case, it was, what would the community need to look like in order for you, if this is where you're called back to, in order for you to be best loved and to love in the best way possible. The Timothy Radcliffe, who used to be Master General of the Dominicans, said, religious, that is, members of religious communities also have a choice. They can either be the most selfish, miserable bachelors and spinsters out, or they can be the world's greatest lovers. Now, for me, of course, that resonated in religious life. For others, it may resonate in other ways. But those beautiful questions, and I would say, I would offer them to you. How can I most love, or best be loved, rather? How can I best be loved? How can I love in return? And whatever it is that I'm discerning, what would that need to look like in order for me to most authentically be loved and to love in return? Very important questions. And so Father Ron sent me away to do something that eventually brought my heart together on that. And it was that lovely reading we had this afternoon in the cathedral from Jeremiah. He asked me to revisit what it was, what had brought me to religious life in the first place, even though I had left. What had brought me there. And I have to tell you that I was only 17 when I went in first time around. I left in my mid-20s. I can tell you that in many senses, despite all the years and experience in between, nothing had changed. So I think God can surprise us at any time of life with our vocational decisions. But for me, I was forced, in the context of those beautiful experiences, ordinary experiences in my life, to have to go back and do precisely what Jeremiah said this afternoon. Stand beside the earliest roads. Ask the pathways of old, which is the way to good, and walk it. Thus you will find rest for your souls. And that's exactly what happened to me, because Father Ron said, go back out there and discern this properly. Take the time, pray, seek advice, because he said, I think this is 100% authentic. Don't close yourself off from it any longer. Go back to those roads and ask yourself, why, when that sister asked me the question, who are you most authentically, did you immediately go back to those roads where you had committed before? And I have to say that subsequently, it has been a journey of some struggles, otherwise I, wouldn't be honest, but it's been a journey of the deepest joy of my heart, because what Father Ron enabled me to do was to look at it with love and to say, this is about God's love. And if I fall in love with God, everything else falls into place, and I can ask myself, which is the way to good, and then walk it. Thus you will find rest for your souls.